There's a statistic that I've seen repeated a few times in the past year or so that says that 17% of children from working households are living in relative poverty in the UK. That is to say that 17% of the children who live in a household where one or more person is working are living in relative poverty. And that led me down a rabbit hole of looking into what is meant by relative poverty when it's quoted as a statistic or as a percentage of the UK. It's a phrase that gets used by UK politicians as well. I don't know how widely used it is in other countries, but relative poverty, as I found out, is a measure of how many people are earning at 60% of the median income of the country. I have to say I found that slightly surprising. I always thought that poverty was a measure of quality of life. It was a word that expresses a kind of destitution, living on means that are not enough to cover your basic living requirements, food, housing, heating, bill, that sort of thing. I don't know exactly where I got that idea from, but the article that I was reading that told me about relative poverty says that how people are faring compared to the society they live in is internationally recognised standard of measuring poverty. So apparently it's internationally recognised that poverty is a word that is relative. So I just wanted to make a video about this word poverty, about the concept of poverty, and whether it's being used in the most useful way possible, or whether I think we definitely need to understand how poverty is being measured in order to properly comprehend the statistics that we hear on how many people are living in poverty or relative poverty. So I suppose in a way this video is only going to be relevant to those of you who care about UK politics, but I think it is an interesting subject to explore outside of just understanding what politicians and reporters are talking about. If we go back to the start, where I was quoting that statistic about 17% of children living in working households that are in relative poverty, what are the factors that will contribute to that statistic? What are the things that could happen, the things that could change that would cause that statistic to change? Something that immediately came to mind is the difference in birth rate between the different classes of society. Although birth rate is declining in pretty much every class of society in the UK, the more you earn as a family, generally the trend is that you will have fewer children. So the lowest income, the people who are most likely to be in this relative poverty bracket are having the most children, which I think is why, when attempting to make a dramatic statistic, I think quoting the number of children living in a household that's considered in relative poverty, it sounds most dramatic when you use the number of children, because there are more children in those types of households. And also, of course, children are more emotive. When you think of a child living in poverty, it's a little bit more uncomfortable than thinking about an adult who lives in relative poverty. It's also a statistic that is massively influenced by immigration, which is a big issue in the UK, and I'm obviously don't have time to go into all of that now. I think it's fair to say that a lot of the immigrants that have come to the UK in the past 10 years or so have been entering in the sort of lower income brackets. They're not part of the middle or high income earners. I mean, some of them are, of course, but a lot of them are entering at this lower state of income, meaning that although the country that they come from, they may have had a much lower wage, much lower standard of living, they now, when they come to the UK, are branded as in relative poverty, even though they've never had such a high wage in their entire life, which I think is somewhat interesting. That's not to say that immigrants somehow deserve a lower standard of life than people who are born in the UK. That's just one thing that can affect this statistic about relative poverty. When I was at school, I had an Indian friend who was born in India, and she moved to the UK when she was in primary school, and I was lucky enough to be able to visit her family back in India for one summer holiday. Her house back in India that she'd moved away from as a child was much bigger than her house in the UK, and it was really kind of grand looking. Yeah, there was air conditioning in every room, which is kind of a necessity in India, but is very much a luxury in England. And it was staffed by servants, but it was very different from the flat that I visited in England that she lived in when I was friends with her. I don't know how she's living now, but her family left India. They left this magnificent house with servants and this really grand standard of living by English standards to come and live in this 2-bedroom flat in the UK. And since her parents didn't have any qualifications formally that were registered in the UK, and their English was quite good but not of a standard of a native English speaker, they couldn't have the same level of employment that they'd had in India. In terms of income brackets, they'd gone from what was perhaps a very high income bracket in India to a much lower income bracket in the UK. I don't remember if I ever asked them why they moved to the UK, why they made that decision to move their 2 children to the UK to have this smaller house with a lower relative income. They must have had a good reason, right? And they could have moved back at any time if they'd wanted to. They weren't being persecuted or anything in India. They just decided that they'd prefer to live in the UK. And the biggest factor that will have an effect on the number of people in relative poverty is the median income. So if the median increases because of the highest earners earning more, then more people will be considered in living in relative poverty than they did before. If we look at the factors that will have absolutely no effect on the measure of relative poverty, we can see that where you live in the country and how much you're paying for your housing as a result of that has absolutely no effect on whether you're considered to be living in poverty or not. London is famously a very expensive place to live in terms of rent, and the knock-on effect of that high rent is that to go out to eat or to drink is more expensive than in other parts of the country as well. So your costs of housing and your costs of recreational drinking and eating will be much higher than in other parts of the country, but that will have no effect on your status of living in poverty or not. There are statistics on poverty that will take into account how much your housing costs. I think that's probably a slightly more useful statistic, a more useful measure for that reason. But unfortunately, when you hear statistics, quoted most of the time, it's not stated exactly what is being measured, so you don't know whether it's a housing adjusted statistic or not. It's also worth mentioning that whether or not you own your own home, whether you've paid off the mortgage on your home and are living rent-free, is not taken into consideration at all either. And that may not be a very large percentage of the people who are considered in relative poverty. I really don't know. I haven't been able to find out. And most crucially, the measure of relative poverty takes no account of what quality of life is available with that income. And I don't just mean, living costs and bills and food and things. I'm talking about what services and products are available to people at this income that weren't before. So, for instance, when I was growing up, there was no Netflix, and if you wanted to see any television or movies beyond the 4 terrestrial channels that were available, not for free, you had to pay a TV license, but if you wanted to get any more channels than that, then you had to pay additionally for satellite TV. Now you can pay Netflix $7.99 a month to get much more choice and a much better service than the satellite TV that was available when I was a kid, and it's cheaper even than the TV license. Now, of course, if you're living in poverty, then having cheaper TV won't make you that much happier. But that's just an example of how the quality of the time that you spend in your life can be improved, or the cost may come down, and it won't be measurable at all by these statistics. On the flip side of that, we also have things like the internet, which are really excellent, but also they've become so ingrained into modern life that it's now almost a required utility that you must pay for an internet connection for your home. So in that sense, the bills of a household may have gone up rather than down. And although I think the internet has improved our lives considerably, it is something to take into account that the cost of living has now increased because of internet connections becoming more of a standard utility that households must pay almost. Similarly, a hot water boiler and central heating is now required in all homes that are rented out. Landlords are required legally to provide their tenants with hot water and central heating in the UK. Even that standard of living was beyond the reach of most UK households in 1970 when central heating was just starting to be introduced. It's just an example of how something that used to be a luxury that was only reserved for the absolute highest of income households is now so standard that it's actually illegal to rent a place without providing that service. If you've seen some of my other videos, you might have heard me say that I'm not that interested in inequality as a measure of anything in particular. That statistics regarding inequality do not interest me very much. And I guess I was kind of disappointed to find out that relative poverty isn't a measure of what I would consider poverty. It's a measure of inequality in a country, or more specifically, in the UK, it's a measure of inequality in the UK. What annoyed me even more was to find out that we have a term of absolute poverty, which is anything but, really. The absolute poverty is a measure of relative poverty from a number of years ago, adjusted for inflation now. All it means is that you take the median income of, say, 10 years ago, I can't remember exactly what the number is, and you find out the relative poverty, what relative poverty was at that time, and you bring that into the modern day, adjusted for inflation, and that is that's the absolute poverty line. But for what it's worth, absolute poverty has apparently halved in the UK in the last 20 years. Relative poverty has remained rather steady. It hasn't gone up or down, particularly in the last 20 years. If we were to measure poverty to my satisfaction, it would be a much harder metric to measure. That you probably have to go to each individual household and observe their living and probably look through their bills of expenditure and income. And even then you'd have to make some value judgments on what is a necessity and what is a luxury item. I think practically it would be almost impossible to measure what I consider to be poverty. But anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I no longer believe in poverty statistics at all. It seems that all of them, in one way or another, just measure inequality that I'm not that interested in. I'd like to know what can people afford, and can they afford less or more than they could 10 years ago, 20 years ago, something like that. How many families can afford to buy a new school uniform for their children every year? How many families are failing to pay their electricity bills? How many families are failing to pay their rent because their income cannot cover it? I'm not saying that would be a perfect measure, but that's more in keeping with what I would consider to be living in poverty. And I suppose that's all I have to say for now. I keep forgetting to tell you at the end of my videos that I'm now on BitChute, so if you'd like to boycott YouTube for any of the numerous reasons that you would want to do that, then go over to the link in the description. You can follow me on BitChute. It's very easy to create an account, and all of the videos that I upload to YouTube get mirrored there automatically. I don't mean literally mirrored, I just mean they get re-uploaded to BitChute automatically, and you can watch them there without supporting Google or YouTube. So I'm hoping that it's going to grow and that YouTube is going to get some serious competition from either BitChute or from another platform. So either follow me on BitChute, or if you're on another video sharing platform that you want me to join, then please tell me about that and I'll consider it. I'm now just over 8 months pregnant, and I would like to get at least one more video out before the baby arrives, and I'll probably have to take a break from YouTube for a while. Maybe I won't, but I expect that's what will happen. But if I don't see you before then you'll have to check Twitter to find updates on me, my opinions, and my family, if that's the kind of thing you're interested in. If you want to see more from me between now and my next upload, which, like I said, I don't know when it's going to be, then you can head over to my playlists, where I have created a new playlist of what I consider to be my greatest hits. The videos that I'm most proud of, that I think are timeless. You can go back and watch them anytime. They're my favourite videos, and I think that if you like this video, then you'll like those as well. So you should go over to that playlist. I'll probably link that in the description as well, and you can use those videos to tide you over until I next upload. But until next time, have a good one.